Here are some strange facts about trench warfare you might not have known, ranging from unconventional weaponry to the remarkable story of the only woman known to have served in the trenches on the Western Front. War has always been a catalyst for innovation, and nor was this more apparent than in the trenches of World War I. In order to adapt to the unique challenges presented by trenches, soldiers turned to both primitive and advanced solutions to survive. World War I's trench warfare reintroduced brutal close quarters combat reminiscent of medieval times. Among the various weapons employed, trench clubs were one of the most primitive adaptations. In the labyrinthine trenches, soldiers often engaged in nocturnal raids where stealth was paramount. This led to the resurgence of more primitive weaponry, trench clubs. These were typically handcrafted by soldiers, fashioned from sturdy materials like entrenching tool handles or whatever they could get their hands on. To make them more lethal, the striking ends were embedded with metal studs, nails, or even barbed wire. Trench clubs became standard equipment for raiding parties. Specialized trench raiders would infiltrate enemy lines under the cover of darkness, using these silent weapons to dispatch foes or capture prisoners before retreating. The goal of such raids was often to gather intelligence or capture enemy soldiers. While the trench club was the reintroduction of a medieval-style weapon to tackle the problem of close-quarters combat, the Periscope rifle was an advanced technology to combat the problem of trench snipers. Exposing one's head above the parapet often resulted in instant death. To counter this, soldiers sought ways to observe and engage the enemy while remaining concealed. This necessity led to the invention of the Periscope rifle. This ingenious setup allowed soldiers to aim and fire from within the safety of the trench without exposing themselves. The design was straightforward. The rifle was mounted with mirrors and a trigger extension, enabling accurate shooting while the operator remained within the safety of the trench. The Periscope rifle quickly gained popularity among the Allied forces. Its effectiveness was particularly evident during sniper duels, where the ability to remain concealed provided a significant advantage. It was less accurate than traditional rifles, and its effective range was probably only 100 yards. Beyond these weapons themselves, the use of trench clubs and Periscope rifles highlighted the adaptability and resilience of soldiers during World War I. Faced with unprecedented challenges, they employed both primitive and innovative tools to survive and gain an advantage over the enemy. The Periscope rifle was an adaptation to allow soldiers to fire at enemy troops from a concealed position, but its field of vision was poor, and there still needed to be a way of observing enemy movements. Thus, a strange and brilliant innovation appeared: the fake tree. These were not just crude decoys or makeshift barricades, they were carefully crafted, steel-reinforced observation posts, designed to blend in seamlessly into the devastated battlefield. The idea of using trees for military advantage wasn't new. Soldiers had been climbing trees for reconnaissance for centuries, but the scale of destruction in World War I made natural cover almost non-existent. Artillery barrages had reduced forests to splintering stumps. But what if a tree could be replaced with a nearly identical fake, hollowed out and fitted with a ladder, a sniper's perch, or an observation post? This stroke of genius was first implemented by the French and British armies, and later adopted by the Germans. The process was incredibly meticulous. Engineers would first identify a shell-blasted dead tree that stood out naturally in the battlefield. Then an artist would have to sneak out to no man's land just before dawn, sketch every detail of the tree while there was still light, then crawl back to the trenches before the sun had fully rose. Then skilled craftsmen would create an exact replica made from steel and wood and carefully painted to mimic the texture of the bark. Then came the most dangerous part: the swap. Under the cover of darkness, a team of soldiers and engineers would sneak into no man's land, cut down the real tree and replace it with the fake, sometimes in a matter of hours. Artillery would be fired to mask the sound of the engineering project. If done correctly, the enemy won't suspect a thing. Inside these fake trees, observers or snipers could hide for hours and view the enemy from concealed, elevated position, relaying intelligence on enemy movements or picking off high-value targets. Many were fitted with periscopes or narrow gun slits, allowing the occupant to remain completely concealed while watching the enemy. Some even had direct telephone lines running back to command, making them critical for real-time battlefield updates. The disguise was so effective that enemy soldiers often walked right past these artificial trees without realizing they were being watched. In some cases, These trees remained in place for months, undetected even as battles raged around them. One famous example can still be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London. World War I was among the most psychologically devastating conflicts in history, with countless soldiers suffering from what they called shell shock, a condition we now recognize as PTSD. The relentless artillery barrages, prolonged trench warfare, and constant exposure to death and destruction took an immense toll on the minds of those who endured it. Yet soldiers found an unexpected source of resilience: humour. Many units produced handwritten or printed newspapers filled with satirical articles, sarcastic commentary, and dark humour that gave them a way of processing the devastation. One of the most famous examples was the Wipers Times, a British trench newspaper named after the soldiers' nickname for Ypres. First published in 1916 by the men of the 12th Battalion, Sherwood Forestiers, the Wipers Times was a mix of biting satire, poetry, fake advertisements, and absurd stories mocking military life. The editorial team used an old printing press salvaged from a bombed-out building. With paper scavenged from local ruins, they set to work crafting something that became a morale booster for soldiers on the front. The content was a mix of comedy, cynicism, and thinly veiled frustration at the absurdity of war. One advertisement in the Wipers Times promised a miraculous cure for shell shock, which involved simply ignoring the war and cheerfully carrying on, a clear jab at out-of-touch officers who dismissed the horrors of combat. Another recurring piece titled "Things We Want to Know" sarcastically asks such questions like why generals always seem to visit trenches during the safest hours of the day, and why official army rations never seem to match the description in the supply reports. Dark humour thrived in the trenches because it was often the only defence against despair. Soldiers joked about the unreliable army-issued boots, the rats the size of house cats, and their miserable conditions that made even a dry piece of bread feel like a luxury. This wasn't just a coping mechanism, it was an act of defiance. Trench newspapers were not just a form of entertainment, they were a reminder that even in the darkest times, humour could be a weapon against hopelessness. But they didn't just turn to humour. Soldiers found another unlikely way to cope with the horrors around them, by creating art. Using the very materials meant to destroy them, they transformed spent bullet casings, shell fragments, and shrapnel into intricate, beautiful objects. This practice was known as trench art. Trench art took many forms. Some soldiers crafted small personal keepsakes, rings made from melted down bullets, cigarette cases engraved with elaborate patterns, and lighters fashioned from shell casings. Others created larger and more elaborate pieces, including vases, picture frames, and even entire furniture sets. The materials were always close at hand. The trenches were littered with the remnants of battle-discarded brass shell casings, pieces of twisted barbed wire, and shattered bits of aircraft and weaponry. These remnants of destruction were repurposed into symbols of survival. The tools available to these makeshift artists were often crude. Many used knives, bayonets, or nails to carve intricate designs into metal, while others found ways to hammer and reshape brass into detailed sculptures. Some of the most remarkable pieces were those engraved with scenes of the war itself, battlefields, regimental insignias, and portraits of fallen comrades. These works were deeply personal, a way of soldiers to process their experience and create something permanent in a world where everything else seemed fleeting. Trench art wasn't limited to soldiers alone. Prisoners of war, with time on their hands and little else to occupy them, became skilled at crafting souvenirs, which they then sometimes traded for extra food or favours. Civilians in war-torn areas also participated in the practice, collecting abandoned war materials and turning them into decorative objects to sell as mementos. For many soldiers, trench art was a connection to home. Some of the most touching pieces were those intended as gifts for loved ones, bracelets for a sweetheart, letter openers for fathers, or elaborate engraved matchboxes for their friends. Even after the war ended, trench art continued to be made. Veterans haunted by memories of the war often kept creating these objects as a form of therapy. Many returning soldiers suffered from PTSD, and working with their hands, reshaping the materials of war into something new, gave them a sense of control over their experiences. Today, trench art is a powerful historical artifact, found in museums and private collections around the world. Each piece tells a story of a soldier's boredom, of longing for home, of loss, and of resilience. What was once a deadly weapon became a thing of beauty, and a small act of defiance against a war that sought to consume everything. Dorothy Lawrence was a British journalist who made history during World War I by disguising herself as a male soldier and infiltrating the trenches to become the only woman to serve in the trenches in the Western Front. When World War I broke out in 1914, she was eager to report from the front lines. However, the British military did not allow women to serve in combat roles or as official war correspondents on the battlefield. Determined to tell the story of the war firsthand, she devised an audacious plan. She initially attempted to volunteer as a journalist but was turned away. Undeterred, she had befriended a group of British soldiers who agreed to help her disguise herself as a man. Piece by piece, the men smuggled a complete uniform to her. She cut her hair short, bound her chest, and darkened her complexion with shoe polish to blend in. She obtained forgery papers and assumed the identity of Private Dennis Smith of the 1st Battalion, Lancashire Regiment. She then set off for the front lines. With her disguise in place, she successfully made her way to the trenches of the Somme, a battlefield infamous for its brutal trench warfare and high casualties. Another accomplice found her work as a sapper, digging tunnels underneath the battlefield. But to protect her identity, they found her sleeping quarters in an abandoned cottage just behind the lines. However, as time went on, she feared that her disguise would be uncovered, and her accomplices would be caught alongside with her. So after 10 days, she voluntarily turned herself in to military authorities. Upon revealing her true identity, Lawrence was detained by British military officials who were both shocked and embarrassed by her actions. Fearing that her story might inspire other women to attempt the same feat, the military placed her under strict surveillance. She was interrogated and then classified as a prisoner of war before being sent back to Britain. Upon her return, she was forbidden from speaking about her experiences. Her book, Sapper Dorothy Lawrence, the Only English Woman Soldier, was heavily censored by the War Office. Lawrence's story is a remarkable but tragic one. Her story remained largely unknown, and she spent her years in a mental hospital receiving no visitors. It has only been in the last few decades that her story has become known. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Odd Historian. If you want to hear about Parysatis, the most powerful and vicious woman in Persia, check out my Patreon, as it's too gruesome to have on YouTube. You also had an added bonus of supporting this channel. See you next time.